In the Middle Ages, time was less a ticking clock and more a suggestion. If you'd asked a 12th century peasant what time it was, they might have squinted at the sun, glanced at the cow standing in the same spot again, and told you it was nearly bred. Because back then time wasn't counted, it was tasted, felt, and heard, mostly through church bells and occasionally the digestive rhythms of your neighbour's goat. Imagine waking up not to an alarm clock, but because the birds got rowdy and the light leaking through your thatched roof lit up the corner of the hay pile you unfortunately called a pillow. No precise 6:45 a.m. or blinking red digits, just the gentle cosmic shrug of dawn. Time, for an overwhelmingly long stretch of human existence, was entirely local and totally subjective. People didn't worry about minutes or seconds. In fact, the mine at hand, that thin, self-important sword on modern clocks, didn't start appearing until the 16th century. And, even then, most folks didn't pay it any mind. Why would they? The bread still baked when the bread baked, and the cows didn't give milk any faster just because some Dutchman invented accurate oscillations. Medieval monks, however, had a slightly more obsessive relationship with the hour. Their entire lives were punctuated by bells. Bells for matins in the early dark. Bells for lords as the sun yawned awake. Bells for prime, terce, sext, none. And if those sound more like dragon names than parts of a day, you're not entirely wrong. The monastic schedule was a dragon to tame, chewing through the hours with prayer and chants, regardless of whether the sun behaved. And these hours weren't even consistent. In a world before standardization, there were unequal hours where daytime was divided into 12 chunks between sunrise and sunset, which meant that in summer, each hour was longer, and in winter, each one was miserably short. Time itself stretched and shrank, with the seasons like a wool sock left out in the rain. That's right, time got longer when the day got longer. Imagine a calendar that acts like your uncle after a few drinks, unpredictable, probably inaccurate, and somehow still in charge of dinner. Let's drift briefly to ancient Rome. They had sundials, certainly, but they didn't pretend they were supremely reliable. Rainy days, no idea what time it was. Cloudy days, you may as well guess. The Romans did have something called a water clock, which sounds elegant but looked more like a perpetually confused fountain. It involved water dripping between two containers, and I do mean dripping. It was a time-keeping solution that took its sweet time. Much like waiting for someone in your group chat to respond with dinner plans. Nevertheless, for most people in Rome, or really most people anywhere, time was still based around what needed doing and whether your neighbors had already started doing it. Morning was when you heard others rustling around. Noon arrived when your stomach began issuing formal complaints. Evening was signaled by the color of the sky, and possibly whether the chickens had started looking judgmental. Without electric light or 24-hour supermarkets, nighttime meant sleep, glorious, prolonged, segmented sleep. Yes, segmented. Medieval people often slept in two main shifts. First sleep started after dusk, followed by a period of wakefulness in the wee candle-lit hours. Maybe for praying, stoking the fire, or asking the deeply medieval question, did we bolt the chickens? Then second sleep until dawn. Some would use that interlude to tell dreams, read scripture, or just stare into the flames and contemplate why soup tastes better the next day. Others, well, let's just say there's a suspiciously large amount of poetry about sneaking across cold wooden floors under the moonlight, this fluid, elastic sense of time. created a world that pulsed, more like a lullaby than a wristwatch. Mechanical clocks didn't become common until the 14th century, and even then, they were architectural drama queens. Enormous, inaccurate, and serving more as town square decoration, with the bonus feature of occasionally bonging out someone's name day, than precision instruments. By the time portable watches came along in the 16th century, people still weren't glancing at them every 10 seconds to stress breathe between meetings. Many clocks didn't even have minute hands. Time was social, communal, and guided more by natural rhythms than silicon-smooth circuits. So if you feel like time these days is moving at an aggressive clip, remind yourself that historically, time has been a much more relaxed companion, one that didn't expect you to run, schedule, and optimize, one that mostly wanted to know when the bread was coming out of the oven and whether the goats needed examining. If these stories help you drift off, please subscribe to the channel. It would mean the world to me. And before you fully fade into dreamland, I would love to know where you're listening from and what time it is there. Now close your eyes and picture a time when hours were uneven, minutes didn't matter, and the only ticking sound was the courteous scraping of bread crusts in a quiet medieval kitchen. Let's nestle there just a bit longer. Imagine waking up in the Middle Ages, though frankly, no one ever really woke up in the Middle Ages the way we do now. There were no alarms, no morning playlists, and certainly no caffeine-spiked oat milk lattes gently nudging you into consciousness. No, back then, time was more of a polite rumor than a strict schedule. Roosters offered the nearest thing to a clock, and they weren't exactly consistent. Sometimes they crowed at dawn, and sometimes they were just feeling emotionally unstable at 3 in the morning. Either way, if you lived in a medieval village, you got up when the sky began grumbling with light and your goats began complaining that breakfast was late. Time itself, in those days, was not chopped into the precise, demanding slices we're used to today. No sharp, digital edges, just long, gentle stretches of moments. Morning was more a mood than a measurement. People said things like, "I'll meet you by the well after the second bell," which could mean any time from mild hunger to actual starvation. Yes, bells. Monasteries, with their monks and their bottomless supply of schedule anxiety, were the only places with real timekeeping. Monkish routines ran like clockwork. Quite literally, once mechanical clocks came into play around the 14th century, and their orderly ringing set the tone for some nearby towns. If Brother Theobald rang the prayer bell for matins, he wasn't just channeling devotion. He was low-key waking up every pig farmer within earshot. But prior to that holy TikTok takeover, most folks lived by the sun's acting career. The sun rose and you worked. The sun dipped and you made soup. If the sun dipped but work wasn't done, you squinted extravagantly and blamed the clouds. Time was woven into the light and seasons, not ticked out methodically by a wall-hung guild machine demanding you to be 5 minutes early like a professional. And here's a sleepy little secret. You probably wouldn't have even known your age exactly. Birthdays weren't celebrated much until relatively recent centuries. No pastel cupcakes, no musical candles, just a vague familial memory that you were born somewhere around the Great Rain, or just before Uncle Hugh fell in the barley press. Written birth records were rare, and the only people truly obsessed with your age were usually your descendants, sorting out land inheritance or trying to disprove someone's saintly backstory. It's entirely possible, in the medieval haze of time, that people experienced life more as a flowing stream than a chopped-up calendar. Days weren't counted so much as felt. The year wasn't 1247. It was the year after the blacksmith's boy ran off to Normandy. History itself was more narrative than number. In fact, time could feel cozy, flexible, forgiving, and occasionally suspicious. Let's stroll very slowly, perhaps with a cobblestone in our slipper, into timekeeping's earliest tools. Sundials were among the first noble attempts to harpoon the sky and say, "You there, giant orb, tell me when lunch is." These worked well on days when clouds took vacations and people didn't mind squinting. But sundials were, alas, less helpful indoors, in rain, or at night, meaning roughly 70% of actual existence. So came the hourglass, a delicate little drama of sand and gravity. Flip it, watch the seconds trickle, ignore how the cat just knocked it off the shelf. Hourglasses were less about precision and more about vibes. They told you that some kind of time had passed. Exactly how much? Who's counting, really? They were perfect for measuring sermon lengths, boiling potions, or timing how long your cousin could talk about sheep without blinking. What's truly charming, if not entirely efficient, is how time moved like a lazy forest cat through these centuries. Slippery, almost mythical. The past wasn't a series of 9 a.m. strategy meetings, but a haze of seasonal rhythms, feast days, moonlight, harvest, and the occasional Viking trying to repaint your village red. As you settle into your bed tonight, think how lovely it must have been to follow the stars, the chirp of crickets, the quiet sense that the world itself is nudging you along its own tempo. No hurry, no buzz, just time, in its natural, untamed bedtime form. And somewhere out beyond those star-pressed skies, another age was already stirring, a world where clocks would talk back and minutes would become something to be managed, not merely enjoyed. Imagine, for a moment, waking up in a world without clocks, not without time. Oh no, time marches on, whether or not you're wearing a wristwatch, but without any clocks at all. No ticking, no hourly beeping, no panicked glancing to see if you're late for the meeting that your email clearly said was at 9:15. In this gently ticking absence, let's drop ourselves softly into the 14th century. Perhaps northern France, perhaps a small village with more pigs than people, and more dirt than pigs. Imagine there's a rooster whose crow might politely suggest that it's morning, though he's not above offering that opinion at 3:47 a.m., just because he feels like it. Back then, time was not a tyrant in the sky. It was more like a whispering tree, or a sunrise rolling slowly over the hills. People didn't really care what minute of the hour it was. Honestly, they didn't care much what hour of the hour it was either. They lived by the sun, which had the admirable consistency of rising each morning and setting each evening, though never once wearing a Rolex. You'd rise with the light more or less. Maybe you'd hear the local church bells, if you were close enough to a town with a church bell, which was the medieval version of a time app, but with fewer ads. The bell would ring for matins, or vespers, or terce, or none, each marking a part of the canonical hours. These were divinely inspired ways to divide the day that worked great if you were a monk, and slightly less well if you were, say, ankle deep in mud trying to convince a goat to rejoin the herd. Still, for most people, the day moved in great slow pulses, like the breathing of the earth. Meals came when the light was right, and the stomach began rumbling its gentle protest. Work began when you could see your tools, and ended when you could no longer see your own nose. Of course, this all begins to change. As the centuries yawn on, we begin to notice something stirring in those monastic abbeys, not just prayers and quiet contemplation, but gearwork, tiktokkery. You see, monks had more than the average need for time awareness. Their lives revolved, forgive the pun, around ringing bells at precise hours, 7 or 8 times a day. So the first mechanical clocks, those great iron beasts, were forged not to rush people, but to elevate praise. A holy schedule powered by weights, wheels, and sheer divine patience. The earliest mechanical clocks didn't have faces. They just rang a bell, once an hour, maybe a few extra clangs to show off. Picture it, a village square in 1386. Someone craning their neck to gaze at the newly installed clock of Salisbury Cathedral, a marvel of hammer and chime. It couldn't tell you if it was 4:17, but it could chime 4 great bongs and let everyone guess how far into the hour they'd wandered. In many ways, it was the ancestor of the group text, loud, unavoidable, and sometimes you weren't exactly sure what the message was. Still, this was the hinge moment, when time, once a flowing whisper, started clicking into place. But still, slowly. Even in the 16th century, most human days remained delightfully vague. The kind of vague where "let's meet in the morning" might mean any time before lunch, and soon could span from minutes to, well, years if your messenger got lost en route or was eaten by an especially ambitious goose. Interestingly, while towns slowly adopted public clocks, the countryside remained blissfully indifferent. For many centuries, a farmer's understanding of 10 o'clock was directly correlated to the location of the sun and how far along he was milking a rather uncooperative cow named Hilda. You see, for a long, long time, mechanical time lived side by side with natural time. You could live your whole life by bells and sunbeams, by dew-wet grass and the smell of stew carried on a wind that seemed to know when dinner was ready. Only very slowly did mind hands creep into our lives, like house guests who arrive politely, then just never leave. But don't worry, we're not at rush hour panic yet. For now, rest easy in the soft hum of medieval timekeeping, where hours slip past like lazy clouds and no one has ever scheduled a Zoom meeting. Soon, we'll wander toward the bustling cities of the early modern world, where time begins sharpening itself into something sharper than a monk's haircut. But for now, we stay nestled here, somewhere between sunrise and sunset, in a world that never once asked, "Are you running late?" As twilight softly pools across your thoughts, let's wander through time not by centuries or kings, but by bells. Yes, bells. Because if you lived in medieval Europe, your sense of time wouldn't be shaped by glowing numbers on your bedroom clock, but by the dong of distant iron echoing across a sleepy hamlet. All the talk and none of the tick. You'd wake not to a phone alarm with multiple snoozes, but to the tolling of the matin bell, a pre-dawn chime so early even roosters side-eyed it suspiciously. Monasteries essentially became the unofficial Time Lords of the Middle Ages, and monks, bless their chronologically devout souls, tracked time down to the 6th Hail Mary. They didn't have clocks they could tap on their wrists. Instead, they had intricate mental schedules tied to prayers, meals, and very regulated amounts of not having fun. For the average peasant, which statistically you would almost certainly be, the day didn't start at 9, or even at whenever the calendar app says. It began when the light cracked through the thatched roof and the cows let out their first unscheduled opinion. Time was more of a feeling rather than a unit. Morning was when the dew hadn't yet burned off the barley. Afternoon was when your shadow started sneaking behind you. Evening was when your neighbour's slightly more responsible chimney started smoking. Mechanical clocks wouldn't make their tickly debut in Europe until the 14th century, and even then, they were less Fitbit and more large stone tantrum. Early tower clocks struck the hour, but didn't bother with minutes or seconds. Why would they? No one was measuring how efficiently they could churn butter or hoe barley per time unit. The only major deadline was death, and even that had wiggle room if the priest was delayed. Let's imagine, just for a moment, that you're living in 1372. You are a humble village cobbler with an unhealthy fondness for pickled turnips. You don't own a sundial, not because you dislike the sun, but because land comes with taxes, and you're apparently still recovering from the last surprise gout outbreak. You know it's time to fix shoes because the local friar clomps by in sad, squeaky sandals and grumbles about divine punishment. You break for a meal when your stomach loudly auditions for the role of backup church bell. You sleep when it's dark, wake when it's light, or possibly when your neighbor's goat decides it's done with silence. Life operated on what historians now, romantically, call natural time. A beautifully imprecise system that relied on human senses, animal noises, and maybe how drunk the local timekeeper was. If the church bell rang early, nobody complained it ruined their workout. They just thought, time must be a bit tipsy today. The Industrial Revolution would eventually show up with a pocket watch and a whistle, and rudely tell everyone that 7 a.m. meant 7 actual a.m., not just after the mist clears. Factories wanted punctuality, not poetic license. From there, time was sliced, diced, and pressed into tight little rectangles we could pin to our wrists. But before that, it was much looser, more like a cozy, half-remembered song, rather than a stopwatch. Time flowed with the sun, meandered with weather, and occasionally stalled because a pig was blocking your path to the market. Back then, it wasn't about rushing. It was about being. You sowed wheat when the soil felt warm. You harvested when the stalks bowed under the weight of their golden wisdom. You slept when the stars blinked knowingly in the ink-black sky, whispering that nothing important could possibly be happening right now. Even festivals weren't scheduled with spreadsheet precision. Sometimes they started at moonrise, sometimes when the ale ran out the previous year. Time, as a concept, was more soup than scalpel. Warm, satisfying, a bit murky, and definitely improved with the occasional dancing bear. Let the idea settle now, that once your heartbeat may have moved in sync with the sun, the seasons, and the sighing winds across heaths and highlands. A rhythm slow enough to be forgotten, or perhaps remembered only in dreams. As the last medieval bell fades across a mossy past, let's tiptoe quietly toward the idea of light itself. How fire, oil, and pretty irresponsible candle usage once shaped the entire tempo of human nights. Picture this. It's early morning in medieval England, somewhere between when the rooster starts plotting his cock-a-doodle-doo and the first peasant stubs a toe on a rogue turnip. The church bell rings faintly in the mist, carried over the fields like a sigh. The year is 1386, yes, very specific, and if you stir from your straw mattress around this time, you're already considered the overachiever of your village. Clocks, as we know them, are still basically sundials with aspirations. Time isn't so much counted as felt. Your bones tell you when it's close to mid-morning. The sun warms your back just right, and that means it's time to stop feeding the geese with existential stares and get hoeing, agriculturally speaking. For most medieval folks, timekeeping worked less like an hourly countdown and more like a narrative rhythm. Tasks followed tasks like the verses in a long, droning poem, written by someone who was full of oat porridge and entirely too aware of cloud patterns. Eating. That happened when the sun sat 2 spans above the western hills. Church, when the bell rang. Sleep, somewhere between the stars came out and you just couldn't take it anymore. Now, that's normal village life. But if you found yourself in a medieval monastery, your relationship with time would shift dramatically. Monks were the apex time nerds of their day. They followed the liturgy of the hours, a schedule so packed with prayers, psalms, and organ warm-ups that it made modern office emails look breezy. Monastic time was carved into meticulous slices, matins, lauds, prime, terce, and so on, each one marked by bells singing and the rhythmic rustling of discomfort from wooden benches. Imagine waking up in the dark hours before dawn to chant matins by candlelight. The glow flickers across solemn faces, the cold air nibbles your ears, and your sense of time stretches, one sleepy hallelujah at a time. Without smartphones or even pocket sundials for distraction, monks experience time almost as texture, a soft, flowing fabric woven from sacred routine. But life outside the cloisters flowed differently. For a village peasant or wandering minstrel, time wasn't something to be managed. It was simply part of living. You planted in spring when the thaw told you it was safe. You harvested when the wheat stopped swaying seductively in the breeze. You didn't ask, "What time is it?" You asked, "Is it light enough yet?" Or, "Has Wilfred's cow come back from the hillside?" Which was oddly considered a reliable indication of late afternoon. Of course, one couldn't always trust natural cues. Consider the trickiness of time on stormy days. Overcast skies, moody sheep, and a sun that refuses to commit. In such moments, people turned to the village church tower, which hosted the local bell. Your medieval friend with no snooze button. The bell didn't just tell the time. It told stories. A single toll meant terce, perhaps. A more dramatic ringing suggested someone had either died or dropped the pie again. Over time, no pun intended. Well, actually, pun very much intended. These bells became the heartbeat of medieval life. But while the common folk lived by the sky and the monks by the hourglass of hymns, the nobility? They, of course, lived by the schedule of courtly boredom. Their sense of time hinged on banquets that stretched for hours, where courses came with the same pacing as continental drift. A 2-hour pheasant course followed by a 3-hour lute interlude. And then jousting, which was time's most noble and dramatic way of saying, "Hurry up and wait." It's humorous to think that while you, right now, may fidget when Netflix buffers for 9 seconds, someone back then sat through an entire morality play about patience, with actual barnyard animals as metaphors, and only fell asleep once, if ever. Of course, such a relaxed rhythm of time had its beauties. You weren't expected to be anywhere sharp at 10. You were simply expected to be, and maybe help churn some butter along the way. As night returned, gently elbowing the sun off stage, families would gather around low fires, the glow dancing on stone walls and wooden beams stained with the scent of centuries. Someone might tell a story, or 3. Stories, after all, were one of the rare ways people could fold and shape time, stretching a 10-minute tale into a dreamy, hour-long fireside epic. No 2-night miniseries required. And so, in this world of bells, shadows, and homemade rhythms, time didn't tick. It gently exhaled with the pace of life itself. Now, with our candles flickering low and the last cow safely in the barn, yes, even Wilfred's, we begin to drift toward another place and another tick-tocking tale. where time's sands shift once more under our sleeping feet. If you were to stroll through a late medieval town, say around the year 1397, you might think twice before checking your wrist for the time. Not because people didn't wear watches, they didn't, but because the concept of hours, as you know them, hadn't quite settled in yet. Time, back then, was something more fluid, a kind of butter being spread haphazardly over the day, often flavoured by bells, sunbeams and poultry. Most towns had bells, church bells, town bells, sometimes a lonely bell mounted atop a building because someone once thought that was a good idea. These bells told not to tell you the exact time, in the way your phone now does, with smug digital certainty, but rather to suggest that now was a good time for something. Morning prayers, market opening, the vague period when one should probably stop loafing about and just get things going. Clocks themselves weren't unheard of. Medieval Europe, especially in places like France and Italy, saw the rise of tower clocks beginning in the 14th century. But early mechanical clocks were like that friend who insists they're on their way when they're still in pajamas. They ticked with enthusiasm, but were comically inaccurate. Moreover, they didn't even have minute hands yet. Sometimes, not even our hands. Some just rang bells and hoped you'd connect the dots. Out in the countryside, where chickens reigned as both livestock and alarm clock, time was measured in far humbler units. There was cockcrow, which might happen once at dawn or 3 times if the rooster was feeling extra musical. Then there was after milking, before dusk, or when Marjorie finishes grinding the grain, which is technically a timestamp if you've known Marjorie long enough. But perhaps no unit of medieval timekeeping was more charmingly human than the canonical hours. A set of prayers divided into 8 parts throughout the day. They formed a kind of spiritual schedule for monasteries, and by soft influence for the towns nearby. Matins, lauds, prime, terce, sext, none, vespers, and compline. Each fell at a specific turning point in the day. Sundial approximated and skywatching adjusted. Now, one might imagine monks waking up with angelic composure for their 3 a.m. matins. But let's be clear, it was cold, dark, and spiritually uplifting only once everyone was fully awake, which, understandably, took until about terce. In these more prayerful parts of the world, time wasn't so much a tyrant as it was a gentle nudge. You did things not because the minute hand barked at you, but because the light looked slanty in a certain way, or the bell told its 5th story of the day. There was time for reflection, time for soup, and plenty of lingering. And if you wandered further back to ancient Rome, where sundials were all the rage, you'd find that timekeeping was both ingeniously precise and delightfully unfair. Rome divided daylight into 12 hours. It's how we get the concept of the 12-hour day system. But since days are longer in summer and shorter in winter, that made hour lengths elastic. A Roman summer hour could stretch to 75 minutes, while a winter one might shrink to 45. The sun was the boss. And no, nobody got a raise for working a longer hour just because it was July. A curious visitor might ask, wait, how did people make appointments? Well, they didn't really. Arrangements ranged from at dawn to when the forum gets busy, or sometime between the 4th and 6th hour, which sounds vague until you remember that traffic didn't exist and nobody had anywhere to be urgently. The pace was slow-churned and salted with patience. Now imagine stepping into this world yourself. The sun glimmers lazily through the clouds. A bell rings very earnestly in the distance, the 15th time today, and someone selling cinnamon fig pastries calls out that it must be nearly prime. You've nowhere to be, save for picking up firewood and perhaps catching the travelling puppet show near the cloister. The day stretches ahead of you like warm dough. It rises, it bakes, and not a single notification buzzes in your pocket. With time so malleable and serene, it's no wonder people walked more, lingered longer, and didn't mind waiting over an hour for a letter's worth of news. Minutes didn't march, they wandered. And time itself felt something like a nap in mid-afternoon, unmeasured, yet perfectly timed. And as the last bell echoes across the sleepy hills, we quietly drift toward the next gentle turn of history's peculiar clock. Imagine standing on a medieval village green, sometime in the early 1300s. There's no clock tower chiming away above you, no cell phone in your pocket buzzing reminders with digital precision. The baker isn't opening his shutters at 7 a.m. sharp. He's cracking open his stall when the light feels about right and the rooster stops sounding so triumphant. Time back then was a bit soggier around the edges, less of a ticking tyrant and more of a soft-spoken neighbour who sort of guessed the hour based on how hungry he felt. Let's ease into this. Before mechanical clocks really strutted onto the scene, before minute hands and brass cogs demanded your punctuality, most people divided their days by what they could see and feel. Dawn, mid-morning, noon, afternoon, dusk, dark. It wasn't laziness. It was nature's version of a calendar. You rose with the sun and went to bed shortly after the pigs did. Very respectable behaviour, really. This kind of daily rhythm, known as temporal hours, was gloriously inconsistent. In summer, an hour of daylight might stretch almost twice as long as in winter, because there were exactly 12 hours of daylight, no matter how long the sun actually stayed up. This means medieval hours literally changed length depending on the season. Smug Victorian time reformers would have called it barbarically imprecise. But you, snuggled under your covers now, might call it the world's coziest way to measure daylight. Imagine if your watch melted to match the afternoon sun like a friendly Dali painting. Now, if you were a monk, say Brother Cedric, softly bearded and tremendously patient, you'd follow an even stranger version of time, known as the canonical hours. These were sacred daily rituals marking everything from matins, in the deep silence before dawn, to compline, the bedtime of monks and occasionally sleepy chickens. To keep track, monasteries began building early mechanical clocks, Gothic machinations of iron and theological intent, not to help people make their 9 a.m. hair appointments, but to remind them when to pray. Imagine a timekeeping device designed not to rush you, but to invite you into quiet reflection. And then there were town clocks, big, loud, self-important things. These began appearing in European cities during the 14th century. They didn't have faces yet. No minute hand, no gentle tick-tick-tick. Just bells that tolled, on the hour, ideally. In reality, some were more theatrical than accurate, blaring out dubious hours in a kind of sonic guesswork. Still, they represented something new. The idea that time could be standardized, enforced, and agreed upon. A social contract, clanging from a bell tower. As clocks got better and hours became uniform, something curious began to happen. People started scheduling their lives by the minute. Factory sirens would later bellow out start times in the age of industry, making workers into clock-bound creatures. Shopkeepers began marking opening hours rather than whenever Bertram sobers up. Time became something you obeyed, not something you felt in your bones. A brilliant shift, but also an exhausting one. Yet, And here's the dreamy bit. Some societies resisted the tyranny of time even as clocks improved. In rural Egypt during the 1800s, for example, timekeeping was still largely solar, with prayers and tasks tied to the shadows rather than Swiss precision. And in 19th century Samoa, people generally preferred island time, which loosely translated to "we'll do it when we do it." One missionary's complaint from the era reads like the whimper of a man who brought a pocket watch to a hammock society. And perhaps we ought to envy them a little. Because while the modern world is anchored to coordinated international seconds, zipped around and down to atomic precision, there's something soothing in remembering that for most of human history, people simply trusted the light, their sense of hunger, or just the angle of a chimney shadow on a cobbled street. So if today's hours ever feel too sharp and pointy, if you're caught between the demands of relentless digital chirps and smirking calendar alerts, it might help to quietly imagine yourself back in a thatch-roofed hamlet. No wristwatch, no time zones, just a gently unspooling day. Tea made when the dew dries, bread baked sometime before the sun wanes, and evening arriving like a cat curling in your lap. And as the slow bells of evening toll in this imagined past, you may begin to wonder how the world ever began to coordinate everything. Trade routes, military campaigns, even the trains. But that's another sleepy tale altogether. There's something enchanting about waiting for a letter that might never arrive. Picture it. It's 1783, and you are standing on a muddy lane in rural England, wearing boots that feel more like soggy bread, craning your neck toward the horizon. You mailed a note to your cousin in London 17 revolutions of the moon ago, and still no reply. Maybe it was devoured by a disgruntled goat, or maybe your cousin simply forgot you exist. Either way, time trickles slower when you're depending on a correspondence system that shares more in common with a scavenger hunt than a communication network. In the past, time passed, not with the ruthless buzzing of smartphone notifications, but like a lazy boat on a winding river. And in the 18th century, the concept of getting there fast was deeply theoretical. Most people didn't even need to schedule meetings because they had no exact clocks to schedule them with. The average villager would arrange to meet after the sun's up but before the sheep start wandering, which is not so much a time as an oddly wool-themed riddle. Precise timekeeping was a luxury. Clocks were expensive, finicky, and often saw more action as impressive mantelpieces than as actual time tellers. Pocket watches were prized possessions, usually owned by the sort of people who also owned powdered wigs, small lapdogs, or outrageously engraved snuff boxes. For the rest of humanity, time was measured in church bells, rooster calls, and the general vibe of the shadows on the ground. City folk had a few more clues. In Paris, for instance, you could hear the Angelus bell ringing from the church of Saint-Germain-l'Auxerrois 3 times a day, marking the loose boundaries of sunrise, midday, and not quite bedtime. People built their whole routines around it. You knew you'd better finish whatever you were doing by the time the 3rd bell rang, whether that was tanning a hide or gossiping about Monsieur Dufresne and his confusing collection of porcelain frogs. Meanwhile, sailors had yet another relationship with time. On the open sea in the 1600s, telling time was part sorcery, part survival skill, and part just guessing based on barnacle moods. Before the invention of the marine chronometer, navigators relied on things like dead reckoning, which frankly sounds like something someone said before shrugging and jumping off a cliff. Without precise time, longitudes were notoriously slippery, or more precisely, unknowable. You could know how far north or south you were, but east or west, that was part mystery, part poetry. Entire ships would sail slightly off course for weeks, and no one could be truly sure until land either greeted them or rudely failed to. When the marine chronometer finally arrived in the 18th century, thanks to the tireless work of clockmaker John Harrison, the waves of maritime confidence swelled nearly as boldly as the sea itself. Sailors could now track time with bonkers accuracy, even in damp, swaying conditions, which, until then, had rendered most clocks about as useful as wet toast. But back on land, life proceeded at a much cozier tempo. Without daylight savings time to cruelly wrench anyone from their sleep schedules, people rose and slumbered with the sun's generosity. And even within a country, time wasn't uniform from one town to the next. This part's fun and baffling. Before the 19th century, local time was set by the sun. Literally, noon was when the sun was highest above your particular patch of ground. So if you were in Bristol, local noon might hit 10 minutes after London's. It wasn't until the railways puffed their iron lungs through the countryside that standardized time showed up, like a meticulous party guest insisting everyone synchronize their watches. Train timetables needed a shared definition of 3:15 because passengers were understandably annoyed when they arrived to discover the train had actually left at 3:07, according to the sun's position in another town named Smudge Bottom on Grain or what have you. In 1847, Great Britain's railways adopted Greenwich Mean Time, charmingly abbreviated as GMT. This brought coherence to chaos, and also helped ensure that you didn't accidentally arrive at your destination days before your luggage or dates. And still, for most folks, time remained something you sensed more than counted. The smell of baking bread told you it was mid-morning. The sound of cows herding home signaled dusk, and the slow stretch of a winter evening when candlelight curled against the shadows warned you that bedtime was near, even if no pewter-faced clock said so. Time in the past was ambient, it was bodily. It wrapped around you like a woolly shawl, not a digital leash. So as night settles over our musings, let's drift further into history's cozy haze. Next, we'll lie in wait for the tolling of towers, for hours marked not by ticks, but by bells, by breath, and by the quiet agreement of strangers. Over the hills of past centuries, where the ticking of a second hand would have been as alien as a spaceship in ancient Rome, people once lived in lives utterly untethered from minutes or meetings. And I invite you now, dear listener, to drift gently backward into a time when the concept of being 5 minutes late did not yet exist. Those were the golden, if slightly chaotic days when time was not measured, it was noticed. In medieval Europe, most people didn't own clocks, not because they were avoiding calendar invites, but because clocks, the kind that chimed with authority, were giant, mysterious things kept in monasteries or town towers. Time wasn't so much counted as it was inferred, like a rumor about the sun's mood. You'd wake not to an alarm, but when the rooster conducted its daily opera, or when the first light slipped in under your thatched roof like a nosy aunt. The day was divided by practical events. You rose with the sun, had your 1 or 2 meals when stomachs roared riotously, which they did often, and labored until the light dwindled like a weary candle. There was before noon, just past noon, getting dusky, and too dark to see what I'm ploughing. The idea of being on time was reserved for celestial objects like the sun or Halley's Comet, or that one cow who always knew when it was dinner. Monasteries did keep more precise time, using mechanical clocks bolted to tower walls, gears grinding like old men muttering in Latin. These machines would ring bells for prayers 7 times a day, and let me tell you, there's nothing quite like being roused for matins at 2 a.m. A cheerful tradition designed by someone who clearly needed less sleep than most of us. Now, not everyone needed such rigorous timing. Peasants measured time in tasks. How long is a morning? About as long as it takes to hoe 8 rows of beets. How long is evening? Until your eyes squint so hard they shut on their own. Minute and second were odd little words mostly associated with scholars, astrologers and horologists. Those brave folk who measured time for fun, or perhaps as a way to cope with anxieties they hadn't named yet. It wasn't until the arrival of pocket watches, those tiny ticking nobles whispering in brass, that a more personal relationship with time emerged. But for most of the pre-industrial world, the day didn't really belong to hours. It belonged to the sun, and the crow, and your neighbor yelling about sheep. The Industrial Revolution, however, rudely changed everything. Suddenly, time became money. Not a vague idea, but a cold, ticking metric. Factory bells replaced roosters, and timetables replaced seasons. Arriving at 7:01 instead of 7 could result in lost wages, a stern glare, or worse, a bonus lecture from a foreman named Walter who hadn't smiled since 1834. That shift in daily rhythm from whenever to whenever the shift starts gave rise to the wristwatch, a fashion statement strapped to your body that also whispered, "You're late." With mass-produced clocks and synchronized train schedules, the illusion that time was now something definitively knowable took root. You couldn't just guess anymore. You had to know. If time were a friend, it had now become that very punctual friend who always brings a spreadsheet to brunch. It's quite something, isn't it? To imagine time not as a ruler, but as a companion. Before the world ran on seconds, it wandered through the day arm in arm with the breeze, with only the sun and shadows to guide it. Maybe that's why our ancestors seemed so slow to us. Not because they lacked energy, but because no one was hurling deadlines at their head before coffee. And yet, even in today's rush, echoes of that dreamy, flexible time still remain. Ever noticed how a summer afternoon seems to stretch out forever, while a Monday morning shrivels into nothing? Maybe our bodies remember. Maybe deep down, we too long to tell time, not by numbers, but by what the sky tastes like. Now, as the moon rises above our timeless journey, let us drift onward. There's more to uncover, not just about time itself, but about how time was told, ticked, and occasionally completely misunderstood. If you found yourself wandering through the streets of Florence in the early 1500s, barefoot or otherwise, you'd quickly discover that time was a rumor, not a schedule. Bells told not to mark productivity, but prayer, your sense of the hour, loosely approximated by shadows, roosters, and whether the baker was still handing out fresh loaves. The Renaissance had clocks, yes, but they hadn't yet acquired the bossy tone they'd take on in later centuries. Town squares might have boasted a mechanical timepiece, often towering over important buildings like a medieval librarian keeping passive-aggressive track of the hours. But these were more about symbolism than precision. If the bell chimed 11 times but you counted 13, that was just your ears playing tricks on you. Or perhaps the bell ringer was feeling a bit dramatic that morning. Either way, no one took it personally. You didn't miss appointments back then. You merely arrived when your soul felt ready, give or take the position of the sun. And really, what was so urgent? A debate on perspective in painting? A philosophical stroll? Perhaps Da Vinci waiting to test out some flying contraption involving a goose and optimism. For most people, daily life wasn't divided into minutes, but tasks. And those tasks revolved around one great pulsating oracle in the sky, the sun. Wake at dawn, toil until the sun got bossy, break for bread and thoughts, and work again until dusk, when shadows stretched long and indulgent, like cats across a mosaic floor. And then there was the night. Oh, sweet velvet night, where time lost even more of its discipline. Without electricity, nights were moonlit and speculative. They encouraged slowness. You'd look up at constellations scholars still argued over, sip warm wine of indeterminate vintage, and listen to neighbors murmur thoughts under candlelight. In monasteries, time was holier, if still mysterious. The canonical hours, matins, lauds, prime, and so forth, dictated when monks should pray, chant, eat, and consider eternity. But even then, their clocks could wander like distracted poets. One abbey might ring vespers while another was still chewing midday lentils. God's time, apparently, had regional accents. If we meander forward a little into the 17th century, clocks did become a tad more judgy, thanks to Dutch clockmakers and a rather persistent pendulum or two. Hours and minutes started ticking with more authority. Suddenly, you couldn't just say, "I'll meet you after the chickens settle." No, now it was 3 of the clock. Precisely. Sort of. Even then, no one expected trains of thought, let alone actual trains, to arrive punctually. In villages, if someone remarked that a meeting would be at 1/2 the hour, you'd reasonably wonder what hour they were halving, and how much after that you could actually show up without scandal. But you see, this slower, looser grasp of time wasn't lazy, it was lived. A farmer's sense of time was stitched into the muscles of his back and the colour of the sky before rain. A baker timed his loaves not with timers, but experience. 100 mornings of mixing until the dough spoke back with its soft elasticity. Children had time for wonder because no bell demanded they be fascinated in 45-minute increments. Still, the mechanisms of clocks grew louder. The tick-tock became a chorus, then a mandate. Time became something you could steal, waste, or lose altogether. Concepts utterly foreign to our medieval friends, who mostly just wanted to know if they had time before sundown to patch a roof or sneak in a song. Today, of course, we wear our time on wrists, pocket rectangles, and even our faces. Digital timestamps replacing freckles. But in those earlier days, time was something you swam in, not something that chased you with calendar invites. A more polite companion, prone to lingering. Less Fitbit, more footpath. Less productivity, more presence. Now, as the light in our story fades like candle smoke curling toward midnight beams, you might find yourself drifting alongside those ancient rhythms, untethered to clocks, listening instead to the hush of dusk and the wisdom of distant bells echoing across hills. In the softly ticking stillness ahead, we'll ramble into the curious matter of how people experienced age itself, and why some were old by 30, while others kept being young well into their late 40s, by medieval standards, practically time travelers. When the Romans wanted to tell the time, they didn't look at a pocket watch. They also didn't glance at a wall clock or ask a digital assistant with a vaguely charming name. No, Romans, with all their marble and marching, mostly squinted at shadows. Time, for them, came courtesy of the sun, when it felt like cooperating. Their primary tool of choice was the sundial, a noble yet deeply temperamental invention that, quite literally, threw shade. Imagine a humble flat disc with a spike sticking up in the center. the sun's light would cast a shadow from the spike, and where that shadow fell determined the hour, unless it was cloudy, or raining, or nighttime. So yes, the device worked famously well for about half the day, provided the weather had impeccable manners. But here's the twist. A Roman hour wasn't always the same length throughout the year. Back in the days of togas and triumvirates, hours stretched and shriveled like philosophical taffy. The day was divided into 12 daytime hours and 12 nighttime hours, regardless of the season. That meant that in summer, when days were long, a single hour could last nearly 75 modern minutes, while in winter, that same hour shrank to around 45. In essence, time was elastic, rubbery and polite, like a well-mannered accordion. Now imagine trying to meet someone for lunch. "Let's meet around the 5th hour," your friend might have said, breezily. But depending on where you were and when, that could mean anything from 11:20 a.m. to something suspiciously resembling 1:15 p.m. Understandably, Romans were often late, extremely early, or perpetually sipping diluted wine while waiting. They also relied on water clocks, clepsydras, a term that absolutely sounds like a spell you'd cast in a wizarding duel. These clever contraptions dribbled water from one vessel to another to mark time, but refilling them took patience, and temperature shifts could make the water flow faster or slower. So in a way, every water clock was like a moody trickle timer, persistently inaccurate, but determinedly trying its best. Despite their fluctuating hours and cantankerous clocks, Romans were obsessed with punctuality. Public speeches, senate sessions, and gladiator games all kicked off with ceremonious scheduling. An hour might be flexibly defined, but social obligation certainly wasn't. You didn't just show up late for the inauguration of a consul unless you had a very good reason, preferably an invading horde. Fast forward a few centuries, past crumbling colosseums, Viking raids, and an unfortunate surplus of plagues, and we arrive in medieval Europe, where time had taken on an almost holy texture. It belonged to the church. Monasteries marked the passage of day not by sun or watch, but by bells. The ringing of the canonical hours, matins, lauds, prime, terce, sext, none, vespers, and compline, kept time humming along like a Gregorian lullaby. Prayer happened on schedule, and everything else found space in the in-between. Life in these centuries wasn't counted in hours the way we know them. Instead, it was felt in rhythm. The warmth of dawn, the tilt of sunlight after noon, the creaking chill of twilight. People rose when it was light and slept when it wasn't. Time was experienced by candle stub, rooster crow, and bread rise. A baker's schedule was dictated by yeast and instinct more than minute hands. If you asked someone in 1300 what time it was, they'd likely say something poetic and confusing like, "It's just after pigeon shadow time," or "about 2 chimes past the bell of vespers." It was, in the most literal way, time that you felt in your bones, not ticked, but noticed. Even sundials in medieval towns rarely agreed. One might claim it's noon, while another, just a street away, said curiously otherwise. This wasn't troubling though. Life danced more to the tune of bells than the dictate of precision. You weren't late. The day simply moved differently for you, and that was fine, as long as you didn't miss supper. And yet, amidst all this temporal looseness, people managed to build cathedrals that aligned with solstices, erect castles over decades, and plant entire vineyards that would take generations to flourish. They lived slowly, but with astonishing intention, like they knew time wasn't a race, but a winding countryside walk best taken with sturdy shoes and a flask of something warm. Of course, there was one group in the medieval world that cared deeply, obsessively, about exact time, and their story unfolds as we shine a candle into the mechanical hum behind the world's first ticking revolution. By now, we've wandered through sundials and candle clocks, through monks ringing bells at peculiar hours, and through a world where it's almost lunchtime could mean anything from 9 in the morning to mid-afternoon. But tonight, we stretch further into our plush historical armchair to examine not just how people told time, but how very differently they felt it flowing past. Slip off your shoes, or sandals, or medieval foot wrappings, and picture this: time not as something you manage, schedule, or stare at while trapped in traffic, but as something thick and wandering, like honey poured too slowly from a jar. Back in the days before calendar alerts peppered your phone, and before every room came with a blinking colon on the microwave, people lived in what's been called event time. In other words, time wasn't measured so much by hours and minutes, but by what was happening. Instead of, "I'll meet you at 3:30, you might have said, "I'll see you when the sun is halfway to the western trees and the goats start gathering near the fence," which is either a lovely way to live or the worst kind of appointment keeping, depending on whether you have a dentist to get to. In medieval Europe, most folks couldn't tell you what hour it was, but they could tell you exactly how long a sermon felt. Spoiler: eternal. Masses could be a dependable marker of time, with devotion pegged to rhythms of bell ringing, incense wafting, and the slow procession of saints' feast days. And unlike today's sharp and anxious ticking clocks, days unfolded like long exhalations. There was early light, the labour of the field or hearth, the gentle fading of afternoon, and then, gracefully, the gloaming. Time wasn't so much counted as sensed. In the Andes before the arrival of Europeans, Incan society used a system based on the sun's passage through huacas, sacred landscape points, so people knew roughly what part of the year it was by noting which spiritual landmark the sunrise aligned with. Every part of the world had its own sort of time magic, really. Polynesian navigators counted the hours not with clocks, but with the tone of the sky, the stories of stars overhead, and the memory stitched into waves. Oceanic time, resonant, rhythmic, not so much passing as continuing. Back in ancient Babylon, time didn't feel especially linear either. Their days began not at dawn or midnight, but with sunset. Every new day began in the hush of approaching night, as though time itself was slipping its shoes off and easing into bed. Israelites, and later observant Jews, shared this sunset-to-sunset rhythm, which made the cycle of creation and rest feel like a deep poetic breath. Fast forward a few centuries and a few scrolls, and you reach people like the ancient Romans, who did try to organize time, but struggled to tame it. Their hours varied in length depending on the season. Yes, really. An hour in winter was shorter than an hour in summer. Any Roman watching Netflix would have had a very confusing progress bar. They divided the day into 12 hours of daylight and 12 hours of night, which meant the hours themselves had to stretch and shrink to fit. So in a way, even their clocks had seasonal allergies. Imagine a world where the concept of a 24/7 store would have sounded like a spell from a disreputable wizard. In ancient China, the day was divided into 12 double hours, each named after an animal in the zodiac. These weren't just time slots, they were subtle nods to character and season. To rise during the hour of the dragon was considered auspicious, or at least a good excuse for being slightly smug at breakfast. We think of time today as a ruthless enforcer, punctual, digital, and no nonsense. But for most of human history, time was flexible, poetic, seasonal, and just a bit eccentric. A friend, not a taskmaster. And while we might take for granted the regular tick of quartz and satellite synchronization, people once lived by the tilt of the earth and the hush of their animals. Time moved differently when it was told by birdsong and the length of shadows. So as you drift deeper into the downy quilt of your imagination, remember, time hasn't always been a straight road. It's been a meadow, a spiral, a song. And speaking of songs, in just a moment we'll lend our ears to the soothing rhythm of early timekeeping sounds, a kind of musical clockwork that echoed centuries before alarms shook us from slumber. But don't worry, no actual ringing bells here, just the gentle music of bygone hours, played softly so you can keep drifting, undisturbed. Now, imagine for a moment, you're a milkmaid in 17th century Sweden. Morning isn't when the clock says 7, because there is no clock near you at all. Morning is when the mist lifts just enough for the rooster to spot a worm and gossip to every hen about it. And breakfast is whenever the cow grudgingly stops chewing her cud and allows you to get on with the milking. This was a world of elastic time, a stretchy, wobbly sense of hours, unburdened by the tick-tock tyranny of modern schedules. And nowhere was time more delightfully vague than in rural life before industrialization. You didn't make time or lose time. Time was just around like weather or goats. In these slower centuries past, people marked their days not with minutes, but with moments. You'd rise at first light, or what might charmingly be called cockcrow. You'd work until second breakfast, which was more about personal hunger than any universally agreed upon hour. Afternoon might be heralded by church bells, the lengthening of shadows, or a neighbor loudly arguing with a donkey, all highly scientific indicators. The concept of on time would have sounded terribly anxious to most pre-industrial folks. Arriving approximately when you said you would was generally acceptable. After all, if someone had promised to show up after the noon Angelus bell, but a wheel fell off their cart, or 3 goats went missing, or they simply bumped into a particularly chatty monk, well, what could you do? Time waits for no man, but it did occasionally pause for a goat chase or moral lesson. Let's drift into France during the late Middle Ages. The hours weren't evenly spaced. Monasteries had their own versions of time, slicing the day into canonical hours, matins, lauds, prime, terce, sext, nones, vespers and compline, all beautifully inconvenient for anyone trying to plan a leisurely lunch. These divisions followed the sun's movement, which meant the actual length of each hour wobbled depending on the season. A summer hour could be longer than a winter one, which frankly seems like letting the sun do your scheduling. Then came mechanical clocks, cunning little machines that first appeared in monasteries around the 14th century. Their original purpose? To make sure monks didn't forget to pray on cue, a sort of divine alarm system. But as towns started to adopt these ticking contraptions, public clocks became grand symbols of civic pride. If your town had a tower bell that could announce when it was noon, and everyone generally agreed that it was in fact noon when the bell said so, well, now you were very nearly modern. Time, having previously been kind of a rumor, became something measurable. Fine, not yet perfectly measurable. Those early clocks were about as precise as a squirrel predicting snow, but still, the notion was there. Communal time, a universal moment for the town square to collectively say, well then, let's have lunch. The fun twist was that 2 neighboring towns, might have clocks that disagreed by 5 or 10 minutes, and nobody found it tragic. Time zones didn't exist, and accuracy was an aspiration, not an expectation. You set your watch, if you were lucky enough to have one, by the church bell, the sun, or the town drunk's third return to the tavern. And while urban folks were beginning to standardize their days, rural people held on to natural rhythms longer. A farmer might still say, "I'll meet you after the heat of the day," which could mean sometime between that awkward moment when the sweat begins and when the flies start unionizing. But the winds of punctuality were gathering strength. The Industrial Revolution would soon bring trains, and trains were famously impatient. When you're shipping coal, you don't tolerate a duck crossing the railway. Timetables were printed, clocks were synchronized. Being late became a kind of moral failing, though still quite common, particularly where ducks remained involved. So if you ever feel guilty for sleeping in or running 5 minutes late to something, remember, for most of human history, time was a feeling, not a measurement, not a deadline, just something you sensed in your bones and the angle of the sun on your neighbor's confusingly wide-brimmed hat. And as more inventions crept into the business of organizing time, other curious contraptions tried to do something even stranger. Predict it. Let's gently tiptoe toward one such time-telling marvel. A mysterious little fellow known as the hourglass. In a small, dung-scented workshop, somewhere in 14th century Florence, the master clockmaker squinted through layers of soot and candle smoke. His latest invention, a large, creaky timekeeping device lovingly nicknamed the Gear Goblin by his apprentice, was attempting to count the hours with less drama than the cathedral bells. It clanked once for noon, twice for, well, no one knew exactly. But it had a certain charm. People trusted it as much as anything else that ticked and groaned in medieval Europe. Time, as a concept, still generating mixed reviews, because for most people in history, time wasn't something you checked, it was something you felt. You didn't glance at your wristwatch. You watched shadows crawl across a sundial or listened for the local abbey's bells, which tolled on their own vaguely spiritual schedule. 7:15 would have made as much sense to a 12th century peasant as a Bluetooth-enabled air fryer. Time was impressionistic, poetic, and usually sounded like "when the sun's about here," followed by a gesture discomfortingly close to the forehead. And while we, today, treat time as a relentless ruler, back then it was more like a neighbor's cat, sometimes present, often late, and not above curling up in your wheat. Agrarian life bent itself to the will of the seasons, not the hour. Tasks weren't scheduled, they were prompted by events. You milked the cow when the cow looked full. You harvested the barley when your knees clicked in a certain way while walking past the field. There were no Google Calendar invites. Your biological clock was also your professional planner. But fast forward, or rather slow glide, to monastic communities who gave time a good, stern haircut and taught it to march. Benedictine monks, in particular, were fans of breaking the day into neat little prayer parcels. They rang bells for matins somewhere around 2 a.m., establishing the not-so-popular early morning club nearly a millennium before baristas would legitimize it with espresso. These monastic time compartments, canonical hours, were their own kind of symphony. Lauds, prime, terce, sext, nun, vespers, and compline. It sounds like Harry Potter spell names, but really, they were quite sincere in their pacing. Monks didn't care if it was dark or if you'd just fallen asleep. They were timing eternity, and eternity was punctual. Curiously, during this era, The hour itself was not always 60 minutes long. That whole 60 minutes every time, no exceptions rule. A 14th century innovation. Medieval folks used temporal hours, which divided daylight into 12 uneven slices, meaning summer hours were plumper and winter hours were anemic little wisps. Imagine scheduling a meeting based on how confident the sun looked that day. Let's reconvene at the 3rd hour after sunrise, which would make your Google Assistant weep quietly. Meanwhile, over in Baghdad around the 9th century, the Islamic world had taken time a bit more seriously, in a way that still managed to be majestic. Under the Abbasid Caliphate, timekeeping got a scholarly glow-up. Mosques called the faithful to prayer 5 times daily, synchronized not to cute little clocks, but to precise astronomical observations. This demanded instruments, calculations, and eventually, gorgeous water clocks and astrolabes that looked like magical pocket mirrors for the stars. In China, innovations like large, mechanically driven water clocks, essentially towering time castles, were ticking away centuries before Europe caught on. Su Song's astronomical clock tower, for instance, was a Song dynasty masterpiece in the 11th century. It told time, charted stars, and spun celestial spheres with the flair of a Broadway production, minus the jazz hands. But it was in cities where time began to solidify, crawl off the sundial, and march onto public walls. By the late Middle Ages, towns had started installing public clock towers, giant mechanical know-it-alls that rang across rooftops and fields, telling everyone when it was noon, whether they agreed or not. These clocks didn't have faces, just arms and bells. Their job wasn't to inform, it was to assert. This is the time because I say it is. Sort of like an uncle at a BBQ insisting it's time to eat, even though the burgers are still raw. So time transitioned from something organically perceived to something externally enforced. Perhaps that's the true shift, moving from time as sensation to time as declaration. But what did it feel like to live inside that change? To exist at the hinge between old sun time and new tick time? That, dear traveller, is a peculiar sensation worth floating toward next. By the time bells were ringing in Renaissance cities, time had started to become something you could hear. Literal bells, metal, clanging bells, rang to mark hours, church services, market openings, and occasionally, when someone extremely important had died, the start of a very inconvenient funeral procession. But before you picture clock towers reigning supreme, majestically counting the minutes like solemn guardians of precision, let me assure you, this was still a time known more for pasta than punctuality. Mechanical clocks in the 15th century were a marvel. That meant they were marvelously wrong. Some lost time faster than a distracted poet. Others gained hours as if trying to be early for a century that hadn't happened yet. Cities like Milan or Nuremberg would have town clocks that didn't tell the time so much as gesture in its general direction. It was less, it's 3:47 p.m., and more, somewhere between lunch and whatever they called dinner in 1473. Still, people adored the idea of time being tamed. No longer was it just a collection of candles, shadows, and roosters with a strange sense of responsibility. Time was now declared publicly, in bronze tones that echoed through the cobbled streets, sometimes even reaching the ears of people pretending not to be late. Monasteries, of course, were the early adopters of organized time. They had schedules more meticulous than a Swiss engineer alphabetizing his screws. The canonical hours, matins, lauds, prime, terce, sext, none, vespers, and compline, added enough routine to make even the most dedicated planner whisper, oh dear. But for your average 15th century cobbler, time still swayed like a hammock. Sure, the bell rang for vespers, but did that mean it was supper time? Or just time to think about supper while pretending to mend someone's extremely distressed shoes? The lines were fuzzy. Shoes were fuzzier. Now, just to nudge us forward a bit, though not too fast, this is a sleep story after all, we find ourselves drifting toward an invention that quietly turned the world of time upside down, or at least sideways with a slight jingle. The wearable watch. Around the late 1400s and into the early 16th century, we get the first inklings of portable timekeeping. These were pocket-sized devices if your pockets were the size of a grapefruit and lined with velvet. Called clock watches, they were both marvels of miniaturization and marvels of overconfidence. They ticked with varying degrees of determination and somehow always managed to be wrong with great ceremony. But oh, they were beautiful, gilded, engraved, decorated like a miniature planet for aristocrats to peer at before declaring, well, I was almost on time, but this watch clearly disagrees. Still, that was the point. Timepieces weren't about being on time. They were about being time-rich, like a Renaissance version of showing off your NFT collection, except more mechanical and, oddly, more respected. You didn't consult your watch to know what time it was. You flaunted your watch to prove you didn't need to know. Because you see, if you needed to be on time, you probably weren't all that powerful. So our relationship with time remained a little flirtatious. We danced around it, stole it, killed it, and occasionally lost track of it entirely while staring out at the Tuscan hills. Time, as it turned out, wasn't part of life's strict rules. It was more like a gentleman at the masquerade, mysterious, enticing, and utterly resistant to punctuality. And so cities rang their bells, scholars checked their sundials, and shepherds gazed skyward, trusting the same clouds that occasionally looked like sheep. No one truly knew the minute, and no one particularly cared, because time still flowed like honey down stone walls, slow, golden, and best enjoyed without hurrying it along. Next, we'll follow that gentle honey trail into the age of the Enlightenment, where time picks up a fresh haircut, a pair of spectacles, and an alarming interest in micromanagement. In the gloaming half-light of a medieval European evening, you didn't glance at a watch to check the time. You glanced at a candle, specifically how far it had melted. That's one way to measure time in a place where the sun keeps playing hide and seek with clouds the size of cathedrals for 10 months of the year. Now, picture this. You're a monk in a 12th century abbey. Your day is chopped not into hours, but into prayers. Matins, lauds, prime, and so on, sounding less like a schedule and more like a Gregorian boy band. Midnight might mean you rise from your straw-stuffed mattress, tuck your robe around your chilled knees, and shuffle off to chant in a drafty stone chapel. Time for you isn't numbers on a dial. It's obligations woven into rhythm, ritual, and bells. Always bells. And speaking of bells, they weren't just a handy excuse to stop working. They were the public address system of the pre-mechanical age. If you lived in a town, you didn't need to own a sundial or water clock, though those were fun, if fussy. The church bell told you everything. Time to pray, time to work, time someone got married, time for a fire, or a particularly noisy goose. Bell towers were the multitasking apps of the Middle Ages without the push notifications or battery anxiety. Time felt slower then, but not because people were bored. Quite the opposite. When fetching water took as long as brewing a pot of existential tea, and sharpening your plowshare was a full afternoon social event, time didn't trickle, it trudged. Pacing was glacial by today's standards, but nobody sat around wondering what they should binge-watch next. The drama was live, local, and usually involved goats. But let's shift latitude now and visit 14th century Mali in the radiantly sun-touched city of Timbuktu. Here, we're in one of the ancient world's great intellectual hubs, home to scholars, astronomers, mathematicians, and dusty manuscripts that could outword your average Twitter thread by several acres of parchment. Time here wasn't counted with bells, but by the stars above and the sun's golden arc across adobe walls. Desert traders traveling in camel caravans didn't measure travel in hours. They measured it in days, skies, and how far one could go before the water skins got suspiciously light. Time was physical, etched into the body by distance, sunburn, and that persistent sand in everything sensation. If the stars shook out like this, and the wind tasted like that, then yes, probably afternoon. Life here had its clocks, but they ticked in poetry and moonlight. Hop again, eastward with a slightly dusty-bound passport, to Song Dynasty China. It's the 11th century, and you're standing quietly before one of the most remarkable mechanical achievements of the ancient world. Suzong's astronomical clock tower in Kaifeng. This behemoth of brass and brilliance didn't just tick, it knew its stars. Imagine a 12-meter tall wooden marvel using water-driven escapements to display celestial positions, time, and even chime out the hour with figurines performing tiny, dignified automaton dances. This was timekeeping with flair and horological performance. Time wasn't invisible, it was sculpted, seasoned with astronomy, and deeply respected. Public time here was wrapped in both Confucian ritual and almost operatic mechanical complexity. Imagine getting your morning routine nudged along not by a snoozy phone alarm, but by a water-driven mechanical owl flapping its bronze wings. In each of these worlds, time wasn't just ticking silently in the background. It was personal, cultural, shaped by what you saw, smelled, and did. Whether you were listening to bells, watching candle wax droop mournfully off the edge of an iron holder, or waiting for the sun to peek past a dune, you felt time in your bones more than in your pocket. Modernity has gifted us with precision. Seconds, milliseconds, atomic beeps that make all the satellites coordinate their little orbital dance. But in some ways, we've traded essential relationship with time for a relentless sprint through it. Back then, time was a guest at your hearth, a neighborly rhythm. Now, it's often a supervisor with a coffee-fueled clipboard. But what if there was once a place where time itself was not just measured in clocks, stars, or prayer, but where power, politics, and empire were built around controlling the calendar itself? Let's follow that thread gently into the next flickering hour. By the time the mid-19th century rolled around, the Industrial Revolution had set time itself on a totally new kind of schedule, one powered not by sunrise and sundown, but by steam engines and bell towers that rang like nervous orchestra conductors. Prior to all this innovation, people were still floating through their days, guided by the mellow tempo of the sun, church bells, and maybe the neighbor's rooster with suspiciously accurate timing. You didn't rush. There was nowhere to rush to. Even being late was more of a general concept than a punishable offense. If you told someone in 1632 that they were 10 minutes behind, they'd probably just stare at you with the blank expression of a cow chewing cud. 10 minutes behind what? But by 1850, a new concept was galloping down the tracks: railway time. This was the moment when humanity handed over its timekeeping to the whims of trains. You see, trains were faster than any human or horse had ever moved outside of a dream or a particularly ambitious goose chase. You could suddenly get from one town to another several hours faster than anyone had ever emotionally prepared for. Wonderful, yes, but there was a catch. Each town had its own version of time, based mostly on the position of the sun. One village might call it noon, and just a few miles away, another insisted it was 12:14. Alone, this is charming. But try coordinating a train schedule across two cities both convinced they were right about what time it was, and suddenly you've got a dozen passengers stranded, a conductor sweating through his waistcoat, and someone yelling that Newton had it coming. So the train companies, in all their schedule-loving glory, said enough is enough. Standardized time zones were born, not out of some cosmic reckoning, but because trains had to stop being so fashionably early or tragically late. Britain was among the first to embrace this synchronized ticking. As early as the 1840s, railway companies started printing timetables based on railway time, which aligned with Greenwich Mean Time. This was revolutionary. It meant towns were no longer timefully independent. Clocks had to obey something greater than the heavens, train timetables. Civilization, for the first time, began trusting mechanical time over solar time. People could actually be wrong about the hour, which seemed frankly rude. Imagine strolling into a city centre in 1839 and loudly declaring you arrived at exactly 3:47 p.m. People would have admired your confidence and wondered whether you'd recently hit your head. But by the 1850s, pocket watches, small, shiny, and suddenly superior to the sun, were becoming the ultimate status symbol. Having one meant you were punctual, or at least very good at pretending. Even in the United States, where time was still being bent and twisted by frontier spirit, the railroad companies created their own time zones in 1883. The US government didn't even make those zones official until decades later. So if you were traveling by train in the late 1800s, you might be operating on railroad time in one state, town time in the next, and nobody knows what time when the telegraph lines stopped working. There were pockets of glorious resistance. Some towns refused to adopt railroad time for years, despite being unable to tell when the next train would arrive. There's something oddly romantic about people stepping onto platforms armed only with local sunsets, stubborn pride, and a vague sensation of punctuality. In all this mechanical teasing, it's easy to forget how emotionally disorienting this shift must have been. To move from a world that flowed around your body and the seasons to one where you're suddenly expected to show up at exactly 8:03 a.m. is a bit like someone standing in the middle of your dreams with a stopwatch. And yet, standard time brought unity, connection, and the fascinating illusion that we shared something orderly. The ticking of identical clocks across villages and cities meant you were part of a larger rhythm, for better or worse. The world hadn't shrunk precisely, but time had straightened out its coat and started walking faster. And with footsteps marching in sync across freshly built platforms, we tiptoe quietly toward another fog-framed corner of your historical dreamscape. Somewhere clocks made no noise, and night itself took its sweet, unhurried time descending. We drift tonight into the realm of waiting, a concept so familiar to the modern world that it's practically a sport. Today, we wait in traffic, we wait on hold, we wait for our oat milk lattes and online orders that promise next-day delivery and then arrive 3 days late without explanation. Ah, the agonies of modern impatience. But history dear dream-bound traveller, had a very different relationship with waiting. In fact, the past was essentially one long waiting room, just with less fluorescent lighting and more plagues. Let's start with male, because, historically speaking, your great-great-great-grandparents were champions of correspondence patience. In the 18th century, if a young lady in Paris hand-wrote a love letter to her suitor in Vienna, she'd seal it delicately with wax and hand it off to a man on horseback who would, at some point between a hailstorm in Alsace and an ill-timed duel in Bavaria, hope to get it delivered. The recipient, upon reading her letter 4 weeks later, might then spend another month penning a poetic reply. Quick communication, in the age of Mozart, meant under 10 weeks round trip, not counting interruptions related to revolutions, disappearances, or sheep blocking the road. By contrast, consider your phone, a device capable of transmitting a message across the earth in a second, a tool so powerful that we use it, mostly to argue about pizza toppings and send animated emojis of ducks wearing sunglasses. Now, surrender to the gentle rhythm of temporal contrast once more, this time in the courtroom. In ancient Rome, trial delays weren't measured in weeks, but in the slow march of seasons. Imagine filing a grievance about your neighbour's runaway goat in the spring. The magistrate might pencil you in after the grain festival, assuming he doesn't have a war to attend or a statue unveiling to preside over. The early courts of Europe weren't much better. Medieval English juries, for example, had to be assembled from the townsfolk, all of whom had to agree to show up at the same time, on a day when it wasn't raining, threshing season, or hunt-worthy weather. This meant that justice, like stew, could simmer for months before it was deemed ready, and we haven't yet touched on childbirth. Today we consider pregnancy a 9-month ordeal, measured in baby apps and pastel-coloured countdowns. But for most of human history, conception, childbirth, and even childhood were all soaked in uncertainty and guesswork. There were no sonograms, no heart rate monitors, and certainly no cake-revealing gender parties, unless you count the peasant who dropped a raspberry tart and interpreted the stain as an omen. A pregnant mother in the 14th century knew roughly 2 things: what herbs to avoid and which local midwife didn't scream too much during labour. She waited in quiet hope, futilely trying to count the moons, trusting time itself to unfold in whatever shape it chose. This curious elasticity of waiting extended well beyond the body and male root. Consider food. In the Middle Ages, if you wanted bread, you couldn't just wander into a boulangerie and point at a crusty spear of pain de campagne. No, you had to grow the wheat, let it ripen, harvest it, mill it, knead the dough, let it rise in the shade twice, build a fire, heat an oven, and finally, pray that your cousin didn't drop it face down onto the only warm cow patty for 3 kilometers. Yet somehow, despite, or perhaps because of, the slowness, people of the past developed a strange intimacy with time. They knew textures of waiting that we have forgotten. The brewing of ale wasn't a Saturday afternoon activity. It was part holy rite, part chemical accident, part instinct passed down from a beer-loving grandmother named Maud, who once scared a tax collector into giving her barley for free. And just as vintners waited seasons, years even, for their grapes to turn into something transcendent, lovers wrote poetry to pass hours that would otherwise stretch into loneliness. Pilgrims sang stories along dirt roads, not only to pass time, but to make time feel like a companion, not an adversary. So as you settle deeper into your blankets, feel the weight of the old hours draped softly across your mind. the kind of hours that trickled like honey through the day. Nothing to rush, nowhere to be. Just time, old and slow, whispering tales through the chinks in a fire-warmed stone wall. And speaking of fires, tomorrow, perhaps we shall listen to how the night, yes, the very shape of nighttime, once crept differently across the earth. But for now, let us linger just a little longer in this gentle stillness where all the clocks are asleep. As you close your eyes and drift deeper into the warm dream mist of centuries past, allow yourself to imagine a world where your very heartbeat of time was negotiable, not in a science fiction way with blinking machines and paradoxes, but in the quiet, sweetly disorganized rhythm of the medieval calendar. For anyone brave enough to visit the Middle Ages, perhaps by magical time glider or via particularly realistic museum tour, one of the first things you'd notice is that timekeeping was, for lack of a better word, a casual affair. Think of it like jazz. There were loose structures, sure, but most of it was vibes. Let's begin with the mystery of the year itself. If you trudged into 14th century England and enthusiastically wished someone a happy new year in January, they might blink at you in confusion and ask if you'd been hitting the monastery wine. That's because, depending on the region, the new year might begin in March or December, or, in some parts of Europe, on Easter Sunday, which, like a mischievous kitten, never quite falls in the same place twice. This meant that for centuries, the same person could have 2 or more birthdays a year, depending on which calendar was in favor. Legal documents often had to scribble multiple dates in case someone from a different town came snooping through the contract. It was like writing down your coordinates in case aliens used a different measurement system. And the months? Oh, those were delightful chaos. Before the Gregorian calendar came along and bossily straightened things out in the late 16th century, people across Europe were still using Julius Caesar's version, the Julian calendar, which was just a bit slow. Every few centuries, it lagged by days, which meant that by the 1500s, spring had started sneaking into winter's calendar slot. The church began to panic. Imagine trying to schedule Easter, a notoriously calendar-sensitive event, when even the equinox wasn't turning up on time. So in 1582, Pope Gregory XIII took a deep breath and lopped off 10 days. Just snipped them right out. One day it was October 4th, and the next it was the 15th. People woke up to find themselves a week and a half older, and with no satisfying explanation to tell their time-sensitive chickens. But not everyone was thrilled. Some parts of the world refused to go along with the new system. England, for example, didn't adopt the Gregorian calendar until 1752. That's right, Britain stubbornly clung to the old Julian dates, silently judging the continent for its papal time meddling, while using a calendar several days behind the rest of Europe. This meant that when European letters arrived with foreign dates, the British would politely nod and internally convert them, like human time zone calculators. Businesses, especially international ones, had to tread carefully. It was like living in an age of misaligned iPhones, except instead of your cousins texting you 2 hours late, it was entire governments celebrating Christmas on a different day. And then there's the week, that 7-day cycle we now take for granted. It wasn't always a given. The ancient Romans originally used an 8-day market week. Yes, 8, because 7 is great for dwarves, but not necessarily commerce. Over time, with the influence of astrology, Jewish tradition, and some serious theological peer pressure, the 7-day week triumphed, and each day got named after celestial bodies and, by extension, Norse gods. So next time you complain it's Monday, just thank the god of the moon and push through. Timekeeping devices didn't help much either. Most people in the Middle Ages didn't own clocks. Only the sun, shadows, bells, and your stomach kept the day moving. Monasteries regulated time with a series of prayer bells, which may sound peaceful, until you realize midnight could mean anything from 10 p.m. to 2 a.m., as long as the monk with bell duty felt good about it. So when we say time felt different in the past, we don't just mean less digital. We mean it was a wobbly dance of holy days, regionally swapped seasons, and birthdays that snuck up on you with multiple identities. Now, as darkness settles more firmly upon your imagination, let your thoughts drift toward how people woke up in such irregular time worlds, without alarm clocks, or even an understanding of standardized time zones. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. The weighty tale of getting people out of bed on time awaits patiently nearby, as towns slumbered under candle-glow moons and time ticked on clocks with hands that never rushed but politely pointed. Humankind once told time through sounds, bells, chimes, a rooster perhaps too keen on responsibility. But what if I told you sound wasn't the only compass in the pre-clock world? Ever heard of the time when your job title might have been human alarm clock? Yes. Before Apple Watches nagged you about standing up, there were the knocker-uppers of industrial Britain. These were people, actual, living, slightly sleepy people, whose full-time job was to tap on your window with a long stick to wake you up for work. Some used pea shooters. Yes, actual pea shooters. A subtle but firm pop on a window pane was all you needed to start your 12-hour shift at the textile mill. Strangely efficient, deeply underpaid, and amusingly unreliable on gloomy, rainy days. Time, then, was not a machine but a relationship, fluid, slightly personal, and often negotiated, which brings us to one of the more curious time-tellers in history: candle clocks. These were candles with lines marked down the side, each line symbolizing a span of time as the wax melted. It was the ultimate fusion of mood lighting and timekeeping. Very Hegel. If you lived in 10th century China, you might have watched time drip away gently, one flickering hour at a time. Not a bad way to count down to bedtime, to be honest. Slightly dangerous in libraries. Then there was Japan's unequal hour system, possibly invented by someone who thought clocks were just too consistent. Before the Meiji Restoration, time in Japan was measured in 6 daytime hours and 6 nighttime hours. But since summer days are longer and winter days shorter, those hours expanded and contracted. That's right, an hour at noon in July was longer than an hour at midnight in winter. Time was practically stretchy. It responded to the sun, the seasons, and perhaps the mood of the plum blossoms. It's as if time came with a personality, a bit sleepy in the winter, ambitious in the spring. This fluidity wasn't exclusive to Japan. Medieval Europeans also flirted with unequal hours for monastic prayer cycles. Monks would wake and pray based on complex timetables involving sunrise, sunset, and mathematics that, frankly, slept better without Galileo. There were 8 canonical hours, including Lauds at dawn and Vespers at dusk. Heaven help you if you overslept terse. But while the monks prayed, the peasants lived by a different clock, task time. Your day was not chopped into minutes, but rather into chores. Time was measured by completion. A village woman's morning might last until the bread's done, and afternoon until the flax is spun. Efficiency met velvet vibes. No one glanced at a little wristwatch in the middle of milking a goat. You knew what time it was by sniffing the stew or squinting at the sunbeam on the chicken coop. In fact, the idea of precise punctuality was suspicious for a long time. To be on time before the 18th century meant you had an unusual amount of free time to keep track of anything at all. Most people were glad just to remember market day. Then came the railroads, the caffeinated squirrels of human invention. Suddenly, trains began running on fixed schedules, and the chaos of thousands of local times became annoying. In Britain, you could step off the train in one town and be 5 minutes behind. Your face wouldn't age, but your train ticket would sigh audibly. So Saketsi Westrait, railway's strong-arm time into uniformity. Enter railway time, later standardized into Greenwich Mean Time. Local solar time, out. Coordinated national ticking, in. Nothing says civilization like arguing over whose sundial is correct. And yet, even now, echoes of this mess linger. Time zones, daylight savings, leap seconds. It's as if modern time, while technically organized, still has minor indigestion from all those centuries of improvisation. So tonight, as you listen, perhaps already letting your thoughts drift past midnight candles and whistling monks, know that time has never really been a strict teacher, but more of an aging jazz musician. It mutters, it sways, and once in a while forgets where it put its hat. And tomorrow, well, that will be another moment entirely. But not yet. Let's keep floating a little while longer. They say time flies when you're having fun, but long before fun became industrialized in theme parks and streaming services, people had a curious relationship with waiting. Waiting, a pastime so classic it rivals embroidery for its ability to stretch hours into woolly eternity. Tonight, slip softly into an old wooden chair, the kind that creaks with centuries of complaints, and let us drift into a quieter kind of time. Before instant gratification, express shipping, and edible cookie dough arrived to quicken the pulse of modern expectation. Let's start with mail. In the 18th century, if you penned a heartfelt letter to a friend, perhaps to invite them to tea or congratulate them on avoiding smallpox, you might have had to wait days, weeks, or even months for a reply. And when the response finally arrived, it often read something like, "Dear Sir, thank you for your letter. P.S. I am dead now. Best regards, your cousin Jonathan." The postal system in the early modern world was not so much a system as it was a glowing suggestion. Riders on horseback trotted unpredictable roads, often pausing for bandits, weather, or a particularly fetching hedgerow. A letter from London to Edinburgh in the 1700s might take 10 days, assuming no delays, no lost horseshoes, and no impromptu duels. And yet, people waited. Waiting was a fact of life as much as rain and tax assessments. You didn't bake bread instantly. You coaxed it, courted it, built up a sourdough starter that smelled suspiciously like your uncle's summer boots, and left it to rise with a kind of patient optimism modern folks might reserve for delayed software updates. But perhaps nowhere did the art of waiting manifest more curiously than in portrait painting. Imagine going to get your picture taken, except there are oils involved, and the man painting you asks you to stare into the void of middle distance for 8 hours a day, spreading this out helpfully over 6 months. Historically speaking, portrait sessions were endurance sports. Subjects sat stiff-backed and noble-jawed, enduring an itch and the tip of their nose for 6 weeks. Sir Thomas More's face may have looked wise and serene in oils, but in reality, he was probably wondering if he could sneeze in iambic pentameter. Now shift to matters of love. In a modern romance, we might text each other heart emojis before lunch, but in another age, Feelings were relayed by glances across candlelit parlours, meticulously folded notes, and, my personal favourite, a length of hair sent by post. Yes, people exchanged locks of hair as though saying, "While you wait to hear if I return your affections, have this scalp souvenir." Courtships could stretch on for years. Families got involved. Entire economies based on matchmaking arose. Tea was sipped at an achingly slow pace, while potential suitors debated the relative sturdiness of their respective family trees. And through it all, they waited. But before you feel too smug about your ability to receive pizza in under 30 minutes, remember, we still wait. Only now we wait, differently. We tap at red lights, reload screens when someone's typing, and grumble that our movie won't buffer in 4K. There was a rhythm to old waiting, a slower beat beneath the parchment and ticking mantle clocks. Time didn't fly. It loitered. It leaned on fences and watched the clouds go by. There is something beautifully stubborn about a life that doesn't hurry. Not because it can't, but because it doesn't need to. Time was teaching patience by letting things take as long as they needed. Imagine your morning coffee requiring you to roast, grind, and percolate your own beans using a hand-cranked device that also serves as a rudimentary arm workout and occasionally a marital stress test. And yet, even then, perhaps because of then, people found magic in the wait. The long, slow unraveling of a moment. The village forge buzzing with gossip while a horseshoe was hammered to life. The anticipation before the mutton stew revealed itself as either deeply, comforting, or mildly suspicious. So perhaps tonight, as your own brain quiets like a sleepy town square at dusk, allow yourself to believe that time isn't always chasing us. Sometimes it's leaning idly by the fireplace, waiting for us to catch up. Let's take another easy step forward, into a world with still fewer clocks, where days were marked by shadows, prayers, and the call of the village bell, beneath the hesitant flicker of candlelight in a late 18th century salon. Time moved like a polite guest at tea, never rushed, never abrupt, always ready to excuse itself. Clocks ticked quietly in the corner. Mirrors were draped in velvet to protect their souls, or so it was believed, and social calls could stretch out for hours, like an overextended sigh. No one checked their pocket watch every 10 minutes, partly because winding it was a chore, and partly because showing impatience meant one wasn't properly marinated in etiquette. This was the age when leisure had hierarchy. If you had time to languidly pen your third letter of the afternoon to your third cousin, with news of your third dog's sore paw, well, congratulations, you'd made it. Aristocrats moved through time like cats in sunbeams, expertly, and only when it suited them. But for the rest of the world, tradesmen, servants, shoppers, and professional pudding stirrers, time had texture. Markets didn't have strict opening and closing hours. You simply arrived when the cabbages did and left when the cheese began to sweat. A good butcher could eye the sky and tell whether it was time for mutton or roast goose, while a cobbler knew the hour only by the frequency of muddy boots clomping down the lane. The irony, of course, is that this gentle, uneven tempo was disrupted not by science, but trains. Yes, polished, huffing, soot-dripping trains. With the dawn of railway networks in the 19th century, the world suddenly realized a startling truth. One town's noon was another's, almost noon, or worse, yesterday's noon in times of fog and bureaucratic error. It became deeply awkward to run a railway if everyone was still operating by their own sundials and strong opinions. Imagine sending a train from Manchester to London, and halfway there, the clock decided it was 15 minutes behind. arrivals became theoretical. Enter railway time. Ah yes, railway time. Possibly the most punctual revolution in human history. It didn't overthrow monarchs, but it did declare that when the train says 3:17, by thunder, it means 3:17. Towns began adjusting their clocks to match Greenwich Mean Time, which had positioned itself confidently as the temporal capital of the empire. The shift was so significant that some local governments resisted, citing centuries of knowing perfectly well what lunchtime felt like without London meddling in it. Meanwhile, churches grumbled as their bells were retuned, and their mechanical innards adjusted to the new regime of minutes. That really counted. Even the sun played second fiddle to the iron timetables now. Solar time, once the gold standard for telling whether to gather wheat or go home to boil potatoes, became something you mentioned only to poets or beekeepers. Time became standardized, regularized, and slightly more square-shouldered. There were now schedules, ticket booths with clocks, and an onslaught of pocket watches swung with urgency. The Victorian gentleman could now express superiority not merely with his moustache, but also with punctuality. To be early was to be respectable. To be late, scandalous. But the devotion to precision didn't end with locomotives. Telegraph companies demanded accurate timekeeping to synchronize messages, lest one telegram arrive before it was allegedly sent. A temporal loop risky enough to cause mild philosophical nausea. Schools, factories, and even lunchtime began aligning with this rigid grid. And yet, not everyone was thrilled. In rural pockets and cozy shires, folk still insisted that the rooster crowed at the right time, and the seasons knew best when to start. After all, their cows didn't wear watches. It wasn't just technology that changed time. It was belief. We reimagined our place in the day, and the day itself was shaped into little painted boxes meant to be filled with industry and civil plans. But if you wander into a forgotten corner of the world, a sleepy village with a broken sundial and a pub named after something nobody remembers, you might just find that time still stretches lazily, like a cat with no commitments. And somewhere between the hissing steam of a departing train and the ghost of a bell that once rang noon to its own tune, history settled into its new rhythm. Now, smooth your blanket, dear listener, and glide gently through the minutes like a feather on a breeze. For next, we'll take a dreamy look at how calendars themselves flirted, fought, and occasionally ghosted entire days. As twilight stretches across the ancient skyline of Constantinople, imperial purple melting into gold, you might find yourself seated near the bustling harbour of 10th century Byzantium, watching the world move at the speed of, well, a very determined tortoise. Because for all the glittering mosaics and theological debates, life in the past had one defining trait: exquisitely slow timing, which, as it turns out, was entirely deliberate. Let us saunter deeper into this bygone tempo. You see, your ancestors were not in a rush, largely because life didn't give them clocks, but also because no one expected them at 9 a.m. sharp, unless sunlight and roosters coordinated a memo. Medieval time, for example, was famously vague. Technically, it was divided into 12 hours of daylight and 12 hours of darkness, but those hours got longer in summer and shorter in winter, like molasses stretching and shrinking in the seasonal sun. An hour in December might be 45 minutes long, or as they called it back then, a regrettably short prayer nap. And if you were lucky enough to live near a monastery, your entire day might be regulated by the chanting of monks performing the divine office. These prayer sessions, matins, lauds, prime, terce, and so on, were as constant as Instagram notifications, but with considerably more incense. The bells would ring, and you'd mutter, "Ah, terce already," as if you had any real idea what terce was, or how long ago breakfast happened. Merchants and farmers relied on another beautifully imprecise device for tracking time, the human shadow. The sundial, essentially a fancy stick in the ground, would whisper things like, "Now," or maybe a bit later, definitely before dusk. People didn't mind. The rhythm of nature governed everything. If the sun wasn't up, neither were you. And if it rained, well, you weren't going to work anyway, unless you were a peasant, in which case you worked whether it rained, snowed, or descended into plague-tainted pestilence. But let's not get gloomy. Let's float to the Renaissance, where time began to flirt with precision. Yes, clocks were emerging, gorgeous labyrinths of gears aspiring to tick regularly. In the 14th century, Italian towns like Milan and Bologna erected mechanical clocks in town squares. These ornate monsters didn't tell the exact time, mind you. They just rang a bell every so often so people could say, "Huh, must be bell o'clock again." Yet, attitudes remained famously loose. The great artists and thinkers of Florence missed appointments without guilt. Michelangelo could promise to meet you sometime after Vespers and show up 4 days later with a chisel and some olive oil and expect a warm welcome. People weren't late. They were merely temporarily uncommitted. Contrast that with how you live now, clicking between time zones like a caffeinated falcon, obsessing over meeting invites and productivity hacks. Your watch doesn't just tick, it vibrates, nags, and, in some cases, reminds you to breathe. You schedule relaxation. You get stressed about meditation. Oh, how proud the peasants of yore would be to know you now need special apps to remind you to rest. But back then, things happened when they happened. The harvest came not because the calendar said September, but because the wheat turned golden and a neighbor named Alric declared it crunchy enough. Dinner parties, more likely feasts to celebrate random saints, began when the stew smelled right and someone had managed to capture a lute player. Time was less a ruler and more a respected village elder. It made suggestions, not demands. Of course, there were exceptions. In 18th century London, when accurate watches became fashionable among the moneyed classes, being punctual became a sign of civility. If you were late, it meant you lacked discipline, or worse, that you hadn't spent enough money on a sufficiently loud pocket watch. Social reputation ticked to a new rhythm quite literally, and so the centuries tightened. Time began to matter more, march faster, and ring louder. But for a final moment, let's imagine a different night. You're lying on a straw mattress inside a modest Tudor home. Outside, the moon leans low, casting shadows on wattle and daub walls. There's no flicker of electricity, no calendar app named after a fruit, no urgent yellow folder marked Monday deadlines. Only the crackle of the hearth and the tickless, tender hush of medieval stillness. You sleep when it's dark. You wake with the roosters. And time is not a thief or a tyrant, but a fellow traveller, ambling beside you at a gentle, cobbled pace. Drift gently and hold that scene, the sloth of it. For in just a moment, we'll take one last dreamy step together. There's a certain kind of hush that falls over a world just before sleep, and that's where time becomes the softest thing of all. And now, as you float through the sleepy vapors of history's final embers tonight, we find ourselves not in a ticking clock, nor in a sun-dialed garden, but somewhere between the two, on the edge of time and timelessness, and possibly an overcooked medieval stew. Imagine you're a villager in 14th century France. No clocks, no calendar pages to peel away. Just bells, so many bells. They tell you when to rise, when to eat, when to pray, and when to stop pretending that you're farming and go gossip in the field instead. The hours, if you could call them that, stretch and compress depending on the sun, the moon, and your master's mood. And frankly, the sun, much like a landlord with a questionable mustache, rises when it pleases. Your days are not measured by 4:30 p.m, but by after the cows have begun their sarcastic mooing. Your week, structured not by 7 names, but by the market cycle, the feast of St. Gertrude, and how soggy your shoes feel by Thursday-ish. Now fast forward, gently, slowly, like a butter-churning time traveller to the 1700s. We arrive in London, that sooty kingdom of wigs, watches and worry. Ah yes, the pocket watch. Finally, a device that let gentlemen declare, "I'm late," with absolute certainty and a healthy sprinkling of superiority. Time is now portable, just like cheese or a mild debt. But the real kicker, the thing that tightens time like a poorly laced corset, is the Industrial Revolution. Yes, those long-bearded inventors and owners of questionable hats really picked up the pace. Suddenly, time isn't just a frequent suggestion, it's a steel-fisted supervisor. Clocks aren't decorative anymore. They're screaming overlords demanding, "Get on that train by 7:02 and don't you dare be 7:03. Train schedules, factory whistles and the dreaded punch clock. Ah, nothing says progress like being yelled at by brass gears. And with all that progress, time is no longer a flow. It's a commodity you borrow on weekends and repay in choitis Monday dread. But even then, the human soul holds a private rebellion. Children, unlicensed experts in slowing down afternoons, continue to dilate time by sheer will. Grandmothers, wide-eyed sages by the stove, still speak of the good old days, which historians suspect were just as damp and confusing as yesterday. And whispering behind it all, the seasons continue their dependable circle. Spring stretches days like dough. Summer burns them loudly into the air. Autumn compresses them like a page in a forgotten book. And winter, oh winter. Winter is the ultimate time anesthetic, where each moment is a cup of tea and a candle, and no one remembers when Tuesday arrived, or if it ever plans to leave. Even digital time today, buzzing, glowing, politely useful, can't outwit the quiet truth that time feels different depending on where you are, what you're doing, and exactly how loud your cat is being during breakfast. Cultures around the world have long flirted with a more fluid sense of time. The Hopi people, for instance, don't even have tenses for past and future in the traditional way. Everything is a cycle, a returning and unfolding circle of now. In their worldview, perhaps nothing really ends. It only comes around again, always familiar, always new, like your favorite socks, or an oddly specific dream of Julius Caesar making soup. So yes, in the cozy cabinets of history, time isn't so much a ruler as it is a mood. And history's greatest secret might just be that time never wanted to be a tyrant. It merely wanted to be a nap. And now, dear sleeper, with your own clock gently humming beside you, and every tick folding softly into a tock, the world may tiptoe around your eyelids, tuck you beneath the quilted pages of the past, and let you drift. Tomorrow will be here when it's ready, but tonight, you're already exactly when you need to be.